So Professor Plummer, first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this panel. Very much appreciated.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Your expertise is economic geography, and we thought that here's an opportunity for us, given that we're looking to get diverse perspectives on entrepreneurial action. We thought here's an opportunity for us to hear you about how do you think economic geography shapes, influences entrepreneurial actions. Uh, Perhaps share with us what the current state of the literature is, and if there are any opportunities for future research that you identified. Talk about that.
No, I'm glad to do that. So I thought what I would do to answer your question is to actually use some slides that I use when I'm teaching the geography of entrepreneurship to executive education. So this is the kind of slide work that I would the kind of slides rather that I would share when I'm talking to entrepreneurs about how geography influences entrepreneurship. So so I'm not going to go through all these in super detail, but the thinking is that there is a perception that because of communications and transportation that where you locate your business doesn't matter. And actually what we've observed over the years is that actually especially since the publication of this book, The Death of Distance in 1996, in that time, we've actually seen a tremendous increase, not decrease, in the concentration of businesses and industries in particular locations. So, we think that somehow being freed from having to be near our customers, entrepreneurs are still finding it necessary to be located around groups of talent, say labor pools or resources, and even are being influenced by opportunities that are concentrated regionally. So, you asked me about the current state of the literature. Here's a couple things we do know. We do know that from the literature that location conditions will affect the startup, the formation of startups. So it would influence the kinds of opportunities that people are likely to recognize. It's going to affect the kinds of resources that might be available to launch a venture. Because a lot of times entrepreneurs, one definition of entrepreneurship is, of course, the corralling of resources outside of our controls in order to be able to launch a new organization or to act entrepreneurially. But we also know that because of location conditions, that different regions will have different effects on the prospects for survival, growth, and the evolution of new businesses as they evolve into mature organizations. So there is actually not a lot of elements of entrepreneurial action that are not affected by geographic location. But I would say it's principally through two things. One is the resources that are available to act entrepreneurially, and also the opportunities that people are likely to recognize. Those are also going to be influenced by local conditions. Again, when I'm talking about geography of entrepreneurship, one thing I want to make really clear is that a geographic lens to study entrepreneurship is not automatically an institutional lens. I get this a lot. The perception is that location is just institutional environment. There's no doubt that there's a relationship between institutional environments and geographic environments. A lot of times geographic borders are also the borders for institutional boundaries. But I'll use a very specific example, which is in a place like Ontario, which is a very large, that's the territory in red in here. For anyone who knows the US geography, for example, they will realize that Ontario stretches all the way from upstate New York over to Minnesota. All of the Great Lakes, for example, are actually touching on the Ontario border. They're entirely contained within the Ontario region, sandwiched between Ontario and the United States. But in a place like Ontario, when the provincial government passes a law like a minimum wage increase, that's uniform across the entire province. But as you know from your own research, Caton, the kinds of environments across such a diverse province, from everything from a highly urbanized space like Toronto to places, these tiny communities way up north on the Hudson Bay, which are only accessible by road during the winter when the ice roads open up. All of these places share the same institutional environment for the most part. Might be a couple of municipal differences in local rules and regulations, but for the most part, all of these places are under the same institutional conditions. And yet, of course, we expect, and we should expect to see, significant differences in what entrepreneurial action looks like across the province, across an area, a region this big and this diverse. Forms of geography. The geography we talk about most is going to be things like physical geography. How does physical geography affect entrepreneurial action? As I'll explain in a second, the physical geography is not as interesting from a theoretical lens point of view. But the one we're really interested in is the human geography. So when we talk about physical geography to start with, for example, we talk about things like, literally the geologic features that might affect the location of industry. And it's still a common practice to look for waterfalls as a place to find the location for heavy industry. Fall lines is something we talk a lot about. So here's an image of the state of Virginia that shows there's a fall line, and it's literally where you're likely to find waterfalls, which of course were used for industrial power before the advent of electricity. So thus, no surprise, a lot of major cities in the state of Virginia, all the way up to the state of New Jersey, Interstate 95, the highway actually traces along this route. So we know that geologic features are definitely affecting the location of different kinds of economic. And the same is true for Ontario, say with the Niagara Escarpment and so on. So if you are a newcomer to Ontario, for example, and you're wondering where is Ontario's heavy industry likely to be located, well, we want to be looking for a couple of things: access to water and waterfalls.
Right.
And this is an example from the All Trails app. And what this is literally a count of the number of waterfalls. And you can see right here that there's a large number of waterfalls located in the city of Hamilton. And of course, the city of Hamilton has easy access to the Great Lakes for shipping. Ergo, no surprise, the Hammer of Ontario, as its nickname is, the city of Hamilton, is of course going to be located right here.
Right.
Interesting. One more example of physical geography affecting, is Sudbury, Ontario, which is probably the most northernmost city in Ontario, is the location of a major impact crater. And we know that when meteors slam into the earth, they tend to create lots of, heavy metal deposits: zinc, nickel, lead, silver, copper, and of course, good farmland too.
Yeah.
So that's an example. Those are examples of physical geography. What we're actually more interested in is actually human geography. This is going to be the kind of geographic features that are created by where people have chosen to live in the first place. And again, if you pretend that you're a newcomer to Ontario, which is exactly what I did as a mental experiment, where are we likely to find entrepreneurial activity in a place like Ontario? Well, of course, we're going to find it in Toronto, but not in downtown Toronto per se, because that space is too expensive. Right. We're likely to find it around the outside edges of Toronto, which provides access to urban resources, but balances the costs associated with it. Other things like infrastructure, Pearson Airport is what I've depicted here, are going to have a gravitational pull for entrepreneurial activity in a certain direction. So no surprise, you tend to find a lot of entrepreneurial activity out here near Brampton. But of course, universities, the creation of knowledge and so on, are also going to affect the kinds of opportunities there might be to start a business. And so therefore, you're likely to find additional entrepreneurial activity going out in places like Guelph and Waterloo. And the point of this slide at the top of this map here is just to show you exactly that point, which is you have entrepreneurial activity going on in Toronto, you have it near Pearson Airport towards Brampton, you have it in Guelph, you have it in the Waterloo region. So human geographic forces, they tend to come in two forms. There's dispersive forces. These are the things that are going to push organizations away from a particular location. These typically have to do with things like adding costs or making, lots of congestion and so on. And then there's gravitational effects that are going to be drawing people, drawing entrepreneurs into a particular location. Mm-hmm. And in the literature, you'll see both of these effects. You'll see these effects both depicted theoretically and empirically. But another way you'll see these forces play out is in the distinction between the effects of urbanization, the effects of city scale, how big is your city, versus the effect of industry co-location. So clusters, for example, which is industry clusters, which is the common expression for this, is actually a distinct phenomenon from city scale. So you can actually have some cities that have highly localized industry like Silicon Valley, but you can also have large cities that aren't dominated by a particular industry like Los Angeles, classic example.
Right.
So, we have agglomeration economies, we have agglomeration diseconomies, and these are presumably all the kinds of effects that are going to be created through human activity, human geography factors. So when I teach geography to executives, I often will try to do an urban versus rural comparison. And I'm going to argue, Caden, that this is actually where there's a great opportunity for future research in the geography of entrepreneurship. Is we do know that cities and urban spaces and suburban spaces tend to have a lot of advantages for entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. But one of the best ways to actually understand how urban settings or highly clustered settings drive entrepreneurial action is to study what entrepreneurial action looks like way out in the middle of nowhere,
Right.
And so when I teach geography of entrepreneurship, I often will use an example, a case like this, in which I'm comparing two real companies. In this case, it's Toboggan Brewing, which is a brew pub here in London, Ontario, and Cowbell Brewing, which is a relatively young brew pub operation up in Blythe, Ontario, which is, and you can see actually, here's an example of the distance difference. So you and I are here as we are speaking. We're here in London. Down here is the bottom of the map, and Blythe is about an hour and a half north up in cottage country / agricultural land. And both of them, Cowbell's on your right, Toboggan's on your lower left. They both have great environments. They have both great food. They both, of course, have great beer. Right. And so they both actually have very loyal followings of people who go there to eat and drink. Sure. And so they're in some ways they're identical. They even both have a little store where you can go in and buy beer from them directly, or to buy T-shirts and other swag that you might want to enjoy. Right. There's also some key differences, though. You think in terms of, again, Cowbell on your right, Toboggan on your left. Cowbell had the enjoyment of being able to build on a 25-acre piece of farmland out in the middle of nowhere from scratch. So the building on the right is actually built specifically to their specifications. Unlike Toboggan on the lower left, had to actually squeeze into an existing facility, which before it was Toboggan Brewing was actually a kind of a nightclub, a place where undergraduate students would go to dance the night away. Right. And so you'd think that, well, that must mean Cowbell has some advantages, which it does in some senses. But, here's a good example. So Cowbell on the right, big space, lots of open air, designed everything from scratch. Yeah. Now, one of the interesting issues is you have Toboggan on the left. One of the things they had to do is, this picture is actually in the basement level of the brew pub. Right. And it's not a standard height ceiling. So they actually had to sandwich these vessels into the space. So unlike a lot of other breweries where they start with used equipment, which is a sort of a standard size, Toboggan had no choice but to custom order these units in order to fit into this space. Right. Does that mean rural spaces get all the advantages? Well, no, not really, because here's another example. So this is a picture of Cowbell under construction on their nice 25 acres. And the city, the little village of Blythe, Ontario said, you cannot dump your waste into the town sewage system because we're only talking about maybe 700 residents. The system is just not built to take in industrial effluent from a brewing operation.
Right.
So they had no choice but to actually build their own wastewater facility. All the water, so they've taken advantage of this by saying that Cowbell is now the only closed loop brewery in the world. All the water comes off the land from a well. It's made into beer. The only water that leaves the property is in the cans of or the kegs of beer that are sold, and the rest of it is treated and then returned to the land through the wastewater facility on the property. So in a nutshell, again, just returning to this theme is, we do know from the literature that all of these aspects of entrepreneurial action, the recognition of opportunity, the evaluation, the resources available to act entrepreneurially, the modes of entry, how you form the business, what kind of business are you likely to create, and then what are the survival, growth, and evolution prospects for the organization to create, are all being affected by geography.
I think this has been very insightful because as you're sharing in this particular slide and over the last few minutes, I mean, not only does it influence the resources available, the opportunities available, but at various stages, if we were to look at entrepreneurial action as not a discrete event like entry or, a choice of entering into entrepreneurship, but a process then. What I hear you saying is that economic geography impacts entrepreneurial actions at various stages of the entrepreneurial process. And so that's been extremely insightful, Professor Plummer.